Hi, welcome to the It's Time for Breakthrough podcast, where we dive into topics on freedom and inner healing, all from the perspective of staying connected to yourself, to others, and to the Lord, and knowing that right here, right now, it really is time for breakthrough. I'm your host, Cassie, and let's jump right in. Hi guys, welcome back to the It's Time for Breakthrough podcast. I'm your host, Cassie, and today I am here with one of my favorite people in our environment, Amanda Amos. Thanks for being here. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
I'm so excited. Amanda is a beautiful lover of Jesus and an admin queen, is what you're mainly known as here in our environment. Amanda actually led my first year of BSSM missions trip with Dean Rass, if you're familiar with leaders in our environment. They healed so many wounds I had, which is on the topic of what we're talking about today, of church hurt. And so buckle in, get ready to probably laugh, probably cry a little bit, feel loved on and covered, but also cut a little bit with the sword that comes to cut but heal. And so, Amanda, I love you, and I'm so glad you're here.
I love you.
Yeah.
I'm glad to be here.
Why don't you give us an intro a little bit? Who is Amanda Amos?
Amanda, myself, me. I grew up in a little tiny town in Arkansas. I was born and raised, one of four kids. We grew up just in the backwoods, backcountry somewhere. We thought we were going to be the next Pevensies and discover Narnia, and so that's my childhood in a nutshell. My dad was a bivocational minister. I honestly don't know a time that I wasn't in church. Period. We were the first there and the last to leave for most of my life. Married my high school sweetheart. We've been married for 19 years this June.
Come on.
3 beautiful children, a 15-year-old son, a 10-year-old daughter, and a 6-year-old daughter. And they are my pride and joy, for sure. Rodney and I, when we got married, we started serving in church, and it was very interesting to find Jesus for ourselves and not just the Jesus that our parents introduced us to through church. And so it was just a beautiful journey, discovering who we were as a couple, who we were as individuals, and then as parents, under this umbrella of the Jesus we were discovering, and in the middle of all that in church. I am administrator, mom, wife, worshiper.
Yeah.
That's my heart.
Through and through.
That's my love.
Yeah.
That's just me in a nutshell.
You in a nutshell?
That's me in a nutshell.
I love it. You kind of hinted at some of the things we're going to dive into today, but we will dive into the topic of church hurt. And I'm so excited because I have so much hope for this episode and for people listening that this will be an episode that actually brings healing as they listen and not just something that reminds you of what has happened. And so as we jump in, I would love for you to just share your story on this topic.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I would say there's, a lot that we could dig through. You're talking 30 plus years of experience with humanity in church. And I think, probably where I'd like to start is just my married years after. There's plenty adolescent and childhood and teenage and all those fun things. But I think the things that were harder to process were being an adult, experiencing pain from other adults. Yeah. When we all say we love Jesus and we love each other, and that's probably where I'll start. But we served at a church for over 18 years in very many different aspects. Worship, my husband is a tech genius, so he was always on the media team, ended up being the media director for the church for a very long time. Worship team, children's church, youth, sponsors, all the things. Sometimes all at once, and sometimes they had their seasons. But 18 years solidly at this particular this particular church. And in those 18 years, all kinds of beautiful things and sad things. And I think, Cass, if we had had this conversation maybe 4 years ago, 5 years ago, it would have been terrible. There would have been a lot of tears. There would have been a lot of bitterness. And I wouldn't be able to recollect the good things that happened, the things we learned, and the ways that we grew. I would only be able to recollect the hurt. I would only be able to tell you things that were said and how they were done, and how many stab wounds my back had, or you know, all the proverbial things. But I think for me, just looking at the story now, it's so much easier to see the growth than it is to recall the pain. And some of that is because there's healing, and some of that is because there is time, and some of it is because the Lord is sovereign. But in all reality, church is messy. We go into it thinking it's supposed to be a clean and sterile environment, but it's just messy. It's just messy. I could give you specific stories, but we could be here for hours. But I think if I could kind of nutshell my story, is just being wedged in that volunteer leadership role in a church, and seeing the desire and the longing for what it could be, and knowing that your hands are tied. And sometimes knowing who tied your hands is probably one of the most painful parts. In the midst of that, how did you maintain honor in the midst of that? You said that last part you mentioned of having your hands tied, but knowing who actually tied your hands, and most of the time it actually not being the Lord who is the one tying your hands. And so in that, how did you maintain honor for leadership, knowing that it was potentially / already knowing that it was hurting you in the long run? I would love to say that I just took it on the chin like a champ. I don't think anybody really does that in the moment. For instance, that I could kind of give you is, I was not the worship pastor. I was what they called co-leaders in this church, and I was starting to grow and develop a gift for prophetic worship, and in staff meetings, lead pastors like, we want more of this. This is amazing. We want you to sing out. The Lord's telling you, so you sing it out. And I'm like, great, I can do this. And I'm like, great, they're championing. This is going to be wonderful. A few Sunday mornings in, the worship pastor pulls me aside, not the lead pastor. Worship pastor pulls me aside and says, I really feel like in this season the Lord's probably going to be speaking to me more often, and so I'm going to ask that you refrain from singing out things that the Lord might be saying to you. Like, great. So who do you honor? I have the Lord to honor, I have a senior pastor to honor, and I have my worship pastor to honor. Oh my gosh. What the heck?
Like, what do I do?
What do I do? And I would love to say that I nailed it correctly every single time. There were many Sundays where I told the Lord, it's like, I don't know who to honor here, honestly. You're going to have to just stop talking to me. I can remember laying on my living room floor weeping, wanting to continue to write worship music, wanting to continue to lead a team well, but not knowing how to do that while honoring my leadership that I felt was making really poor decisions, bad decisions. And so in essence, there were times where they kind of tied my hands, but in all reality, there were a lot of times where I tied my own. And that was probably pretty hard to come to the realization too, is how many times I tie my own hands out of fear, out of pain, out of like longing. And I think it's so easy. It's so easy to put on that victim hat of man, I don't know the answer to this, so I'm just not going to answer it at all.
Yeah.
But I think that for me, in those particular instances, my private time with the Lord, only thing that saved it.
Yeah.
The only thing that saved it, for sure.
That's good. And I think in the midst of that, a lot of people, like, I've even had this being under leadership for so long, of having moments where you're like, who do I follow? Mm-hmm. And who is actually the one that I honor in the moment? And I think you brought up a great point, because we can often turn into either put on the victim hat mm-hmm. and say, well, they're stopping the move of God through me. Right. As if they're that powerful
right.
to do that, or if you're that powerful to bring such a massive move right. of God to come. Mm-hmm. And I think in the midst of what I've learned is trusting that God knows who's leading me, mm-hmm. and if I'm following him the best way I know how, under the midst of messy people mm-hmm. leading, we're all just trying to figure out how to do it and follow the Lord.
Yeah.
In the midst of that, trusting that he can still move under the parameters that other people have given him. Mm-hmm. And I think we talk about this too in relational boundaries of, they're like, okay, whoever has the most tight boundaries, you honor. And even if you would go further and that's fine for you and you're not convicted by it, mm-hmm. then you still honor the one that has the smallest. And I think when you're following people and when God's placed you under people's leadership, if you're like, I went to a church before and we stayed on a prophetic moment for 45 minutes and they were fine with it, I think offering a fresh perspective of, okay, Lord, you brought me here. Mm-hmm. I'm here for some reason, even if I don't know what it is yet. And I know this is easier said since we're on the other side of things. Yeah. And I'm like, just trust the Lord and honor. Yeah. Like, it's hard. And so being in that space of, okay, Lord, I want to trust that you can still move mm-hmm. and that you can still do everything that you want to do, even if you blow up these parameters that they have today, or if you stay within inside of them. Mm-hmm. And I think oftentimes a lot of people, if they put on the victim hat or if they allow bitterness to come in, mm-hmm. they can allow this to affect the way they see the rest of what we would call the Big C church.
Yeah.
And they can run away from the church in total and just all together. Mm-hmm. Can you talk a little bit about your journey of how did this impact the way you saw the rest of the church, and how, whether that's mm-hmm. positive and negative?
Sure. I think when we left, we felt called to come out and do BSSM. Mm-hmm. When we left, when the big thing went down, mm-hmm. you know, the one thing that like pokes at you and you're like, yeah. oh, this is terrible. When that went down, I went into unfollowing everyone on social media. I didn't want to see a video. I didn't want to hear their voices. I didn't want to see their faces.
Yeah.
Like, I went into, they just don't exist, and this is how I'm going to cope.
Mm-hmm.
My husband, on the other hand, still was like Facebook and Instagram following and all of those things, all those people, and he would see their Sunday stream and nitpick it and this is so ridiculous, you know. And so we dealt with it in two very different ways.
Yeah.
But I think moving past that, when I started first year, my revival group pastor was Dean Rass in first year. And I remember stepping into my very first one-on-one meeting with him. And I said, I don't want to lead anything. Don't put me in front of a small group. Don't put me in front of the revival group. I don't want to lead anything. Leaders hurt people, and I refuse to do that. Mm-hmm. I can love people and lead people without being a leader.
Yeah.
And he just, okay. And I watched those 9 months. I watched him just lead well. And he wasn't someone else behind the scenes. Mm-hmm. He wasn't someone different in a one-on-one meeting versus in front of a crowd of 60. He wasn't a different person in front of 1,012 people. Yeah. Like, he just was the same and loved the same. And everyone else was different, and everyone else's circumstances are different, and he loved us the same. And it was just astounding to me that he didn't pull the cool people into his inner circle, and he didn't pull the rich people into his inner circle, and those were the people he led. He just led everybody. And it was just new to me.
Yeah.
Totally different from everything I'd ever experienced. And if you weren't cool, if you weren't rich, you were pressured to be cool, and you were pressured to be rich, and that way you could be in the inner circle. And it just wasn't a thing. It just was not a thing here. And I can remember by the end of the year, after having watched him model, really godly leadership. Not afraid to get dirty, not afraid to cry with you, not afraid to let you sit in his office and tell him, I'm never going to be a leader. Leaders are, you're terrible.
Yeah.
I mean, essentially, that's what I told him. You're terrible, and I don't want to be you. You're going to hurt me. And he just took it, and with a smile and with love for 9 months. And I can remember finishing first year going, I know I'm supposed to be a leader, and if I am supposed to be a leader, and if I am supposed to pastor people, I'd like to be a lot like you. And it just changed and healed a lot in me. That I just had a completely different outlook, that I knew that there were other possibilities when it came to leadership and being in the church.
Yeah. And in all of that, I'm sure almost every day, which as first year happens, you are triggered every day.
Every day.
Every day. How it's honest. If you've done BSSM, you understand there's a saying we have in our environment where you say there's more on the floor, and often that means more of the Spirit coming, and sometimes that just means there's more tears coming for you on the floor. And that was my experience. And I remember being in first year, navigating every day, being triggered by something, and it was all unto the Lord bringing greater freedom and breakthrough in my life. But it was so hard in the middle of it, as I had similar leadership wounds and different things, and navigating, how do I be a friend? How do I lead? I know I'm called to lead, but I'm scared of leading, and all of these things. In your journey, how did you navigate being triggered in the area that God wanted to heal? And how did you press into that in the midst of pain?
Oh, man. I can remember coming out of 18 years of serving in worship and under leadership that just wasn't the greatest. And I remember coming to BSSM and going, I'm trying out for worship teams. This is going to be great. This is going to launch everything, every hope and dream I've ever thought of when it comes to leading worship. And this is going to be it. Recording my little demo video, sending it in, getting the email that says, I'm sorry, we're not selecting you for worship teams this year. And I can remember just, it tore me to pieces. I was already damaged at that point. There was no church hurt healing that had happened at that point. We're talking the first 3 months of first year. I hate leaders. Leaders are terrible. Worship pastors are even worse. And then the place that I thought was going to bring freedom and liberty into my life and wholeness just gave me a big whopping no. And I can remember the first 2 to 3 months of school, coming in and just sitting in the chair with my arms folded during worship. I refused. I was like, Tell me where you're good. Tell me where you're actually good, because right now I've experienced nothing but heartache and pain at your service. I've done nothing but lay down my entire existence to serve you and to love you. And all I have is these tiny pieces of my broken heart and a family that's in tatters. And you have to tell me where you're good, because I'm trying everything. And I'm getting a bunch of no. And, man, those first few months were rough. They were really rough. Everything to, man, I can remember sitting there listening to worship and going, yeah, they were flat. That was terrible. Like, Lord, why the heck? Like, I could have held that note. You know, just the bitterness that just makes you say the things you would never say to someone straight on. True or not, you would never do that. You'd never want to wound someone, but just the bitterness and the pain just really exasperating every moment, just draining the joy in life out of everything. But I honestly, the way that I probably worked, I would say it was work. I worked through. I worked through those things. I actually took some time. It was probably early December, I think. I took some time, and the Lord was like, hey, write them a letter. And I was like, I'm not writing them a letter. What the heck are you talking about? But I did. I sat down and I wrote a letter. I wrote a letter to some of the very specific people that were involved, and some of the people that I really thought, man, we were friends for life.
Yeah.
That just did not pan out that way. Mm-hmm. And so I took some time, and I'm writing these letters. There's tear marks all over it. There's scribbles and scratches where you're like, no, I'm not going to say that. And, you know, you write out, you pour out your heart. Mm-hmm. And I can remember finishing and going, okay, what do I do with it now? Like, and he goes, throw it in the fire. I had a fire going in my fireplace. It's just throw it in there. That's all you need to do. It's not, he said, Amanda, it's not your responsibility to make them see what they did was wrong. It's your responsibility to keep your eyes on me and let me clean up and let me repair and let me heal and let me love.
Yeah.
That's it. That's the only responsibility that you have.
That's so good.
And, man, I'd love to say that it was like a wham, bam, thank you, ma'am, you're healed.
Yeah.
And that was not the case. It did take time and it took work, but I can definitely say that's probably one of the most pivotal turning points for me was in that first year, just really pouring out my perspective of the painful parts, and just kind of getting rid of it.
Yeah. Something I love about your story, especially you coming into BSSM, is that it shows a lot of times we can think, oh, if I just go into an environment that embraces what I wanted to do that other people didn't want me to do, that it will, ta-da, it'll fix all my problems. And it actually doesn't. That an environment can be used to, like, redeem something for you, but oftentimes it's not what God uses to actually heal you.
Yeah.
And I think that's where it's so vital that if you're experiencing hurt on any level with whether it's church hurt, leaders, relationships, marriage, friends, whatever, that you actually dive into, we would say it's the most quote unquote cheesy thing you can do, but inviting the Lord into it and saying, okay, God, what do I actually need to do to receive healing in this area on a level that's so much deeper than any environment or new friend that comes in, because they can be used in that way. Like coming here to Bethel and doing BSSM, like you and Dean Rass were part of my healing story with church hurt, and God used you guys as a part of that story, but he was the one who deeply healed my heart. And I think we often try to fast track our healing in these ways by just replacing our environment, or I'll go somewhere else and I'll be the new person and it'll just make everything better. And it's like the instantaneous versus process of what does God want to do, and what is the journey that God's chosen for you in this healing in whatever type of hurt you're going through. And I would love for you to talk a little bit about what side of God's heart was the most revealed to you, that came the most alive in the midst of this process. Because something I love about the Lord is that he never fails to seize every opportunity to show us another side of his heart and another side of his face. And oftentimes there have been points where I'll have a relationship wounds that needs to be healed, and he'll show me one side of his heart, but then there's the church hurt, and there I'm like, whoa, God, there's this whole other side of you that I haven't even discovered yet. And so what was the part that kind of came most alive to you about his character in the midst of all of this?
I would say it would probably his kindness, which sounds really simple, but I think in the process of healing, the question that he asked me very often, and it's the question honestly that comes to mind when You know, when you've got a rough day and you reflect and remember something that was painful and you're like, oh, that really didn't feel great. The question he asks me is, Amanda, would you be okay if you guys went to heaven and they were right there? How would you feel about that? And I think a lot of times in pain and in hurt, we have a tendency to automatically believe that they're not going to heaven. You know, it's whoever's right is what's going. And that's actually not the truth. It doesn't say you have to be right. It says you have to believe and confess.
Yeah.
And I think that the side of the Lord that I saw was that kindness that leads us. It's his kindness that leads us. It leads us to healing. It leads us to repentance. It leads us to wholeness. It leads us to understanding. It leads us into wisdom. It leads us into everything. And that was, I feel like that's the side of the Lord that I got to see revealed to me about me. And then it followed into the side of the Lord that is kind to them.
Yeah. Yeah, I think we often can think it's, I'm the victim, so I'm the one who receives the most from God. But it's his heart is actually for both. Like we've talked about this before, of his heart is for the victim just as much as his heart is for the person who caused pain.
Yeah.
And it's, at the end of the day, one of the questions God asks me often is, or he's like, do you think that I see you different than I see them? Do you think that I love you different than I love them? And it's like it's a gut punch to my pride every single time. And he's like, Cass, they're a person like you're a person.
Yeah.
And it helps me navigate bitterness often, of me taking automatic pride in, well, I would never hurt someone the way that they hurt me.
Right.
And he's like, well, would you? Like, do you mean?
Wait a second.
Wait a second. Hang on, Miss Ma'am.
Yes.
And he's like, you might not think that you do.
Right.
But and then he'll recount times for me that I've had to apologize to people and humble myself and say, oh, I didn't mean to do that to you. I didn't mean to say that thing where I'm sarcastic and witty and I think it's funny.
Sure.
And someone else is like, that actually hurt me. And so I think a big part of all of this is navigating humility in the midst of disappointment and humility in the midst of bitterness. And all of this is a gut punch to our pride when navigating it with the Lord, and actually being humble enough to say, you may never actually forget. I may never actually have that person apologize to me, but I need to be able to forgive them and release them for my sake, to be able to walk in freedom and for my own life and for my own relationships. And for you, like, you have a whole marriage and kids at this point. And so it's vital for even your home life to be able to release that, where you don't pass on bitterness to everyone that's around you. So I would love for you to talk a little bit about kind of that aspect of disappointment and bitterness, and how did you navigate those things even into your time into BSSM, as you're like the administrator for BSSM first year, and you're in, like, everyone knows, if they've done first year, they're like, oh my gosh, I love Amanda. Do you know Amanda? I love Amanda. She's amazing. And people see you as one of the pillar leaders in our environment as they've done school. And so it's changed very rapidly from the point of you being in school telling Dean, I will not lead. Don't want to be leader. All they do is hurt people. And in that, how did you navigate just the disappointment and bitterness that you felt in the midst of that season and coming out of it?
Yeah, I would say very carefully.
Yeah.
I can remember just coming home after, gosh, I think it was Danny Silk, and he had come in and he had done a session with first year students on the good guy versus bad guy and victim mentality. And I can remember coming home, and I think my first response was, I was just mad. Just mad. How dare he say that to me? Because it was just me in the room, right?
Yeah, only you.
How dare he say that? he has no idea what I've been through. He has no clue the things that my family had to hear and feel. And it ended up being, by the end of the night, a cry fest. I think I stood at the stove cooking dinner for my kids and just cried my eyes out, because I realized the longer that I had that thought process and that belief system that they are the bad guy and I was the good guy in the story, and the longer that I held on to that, the longer that I was going to be disappointed and the longer I was going to be bitter.
Yeah.
And I think, man, disappointment, that's natural. Disappointment is natural, and for some reason we think that it's taboo and scary and we should run away from disappointment. But in all honesty, there's so much growth that comes out of disappointment.
Yeah.
It's what we do with it that matters. And I think that I had to discover that it wasn't disappointment in people as much as I felt disappointed with the Lord. To be honest.
Yeah.
I can remember telling him, you made these people.
Yeah.
If you're sovereign, you could take them out. You put them here. Like, I'm just teasing. But seriously, I did ask him, I was like, you know what, you're sovereign. Why would you leave us in this situation? Why would you even let it happen?
Yeah.
And just finding out that I was actually really just disappointed with the Lord. It was his promises. It was his word. It was things that were prophesied over us that didn't come to pass. That comes from him. Like, you know what I'm saying? Like, just disappointment that he didn't follow through. I was putting in the work. Where was he putting in the work? And then just realizing I actually need to work through this disappointment with the Lord. I need to go back to my grassroots and read my Bible about who the Lord is for me. And so I mean, that's what I did all of first and second year. I dove into the names of the Lord, what they meant. I dove into who he was to the Israelites, who he was to the disciples. Just kind of dove in and found places that I was like, okay, I have disappointment that he created people that hurt me. And it's super easy to connect those dots and say, okay, well, actually, you hurt me. In a roundabout way, you hurt me. And I think that realizing it, owning that belief system and going, oh, okay, I am actually believing this. It's not true, and replacing it with truth.
Yeah.
I'd love to say it was like a overnight success, but you have to continually coach yourself. I mean, we're really good with positive declarations here in this environment, but I had to take the things that I was learning about who the Lord was in the Bible for me in this situation and replacing, oh, you are actually the one that hurt me. No, actually, you knit me together in my mother's womb. You know my comings and my goings. You care for me. You've made me wonderful. You've made me lovely. You have designed me. You desire me. And just replacing the things that I was believing about the Lord that weren't true.
Yeah. That's so good. I love that you talked about some practicals. I'd love for you to give a few more practicals that come to mind of what can people do if they're in the middle of feeling hurt from the church or from leaders, and how can we practically walk through that in our day-to-day life to get through?
Yeah. I think if you are outside of the circumstance, like for me, I did all of my process out of relationship. I was out of I didn't even live in the same state anymore. So to me, that's easier to process than when you're elbows deep in circumstance, situation, and relationship. If you're outside of it, I would say my top 3, get a piece of paper, not your phone, not your laptop. Get a piece of paper and put pen to it and write down the things that are grieving your heart, that really grieve you, that you feel incredibly disappointed in. In my case, I wrote them a letter. You don't have to do that. Just put it on paper, something that you can tangibly crumple, shred, tear, burn, you name it, to get rid of it. Get rid of it. And you'll find often when you start writing about what's grieving you, you're gonna find some themes. You're gonna find those belief systems that need to be worked on. Just getting it out of your head and your heart and onto something you can look at and then do something with. Wonderful.
Yeah.
So wonderful. Another practical, finding someone who is not currently experiencing pain to talk to.
Yeah.
Very often we find someone we're comfortable to tell our story to. Most of the time that's because they're dealing with hurt too, and they're just a good comrade in it. You're both damaged. Find someone who can help you heal, who can give you a good listening ear that's not going to add fuel to your fire, but is going to listen to you and not try to fix your problem. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
If you're in it, if you're in it,
like neck deep, I'm in it.
I think that some of those practicals still work the same. You obviously can write down what's grieving your heart, what you're disappointed in, but in all honesty, learn to have good conversations. There are things we know now about leadership and having conversations and setting boundaries that I would have loved to have had 6-7 years ago. Being brave and having those conversations of if I'd had that, just this actually is not working out for us. We love you, we love what you're doing broadly, but this specific thing is really not great. And being able to say that. And sometimes you're not in a safe place where you can say that. I mean, church hurt, most of the time, we're just scared that we're going to lose out on something. That's why we never say anything. That's why we just take on the pain and we just take on the hurt. Because we don't want to set a boundary. A boundary usually means you don't get to lead or do what you're doing or be involved where you want to be involved. And unfortunately, the big church, the big C, that happens a lot. People hide things. People change things because they're afraid of really just being left out, unfortunately. But I think if we could if we could encourage anyone in a situation to have boldness and courage to have a conversation with your leadership or wherever the pain's coming from, and have those conversations, find a mediator. Yeah. That's so good. Find someone who isn't going to take your side necessarily, but isn't necessarily going to take their side, that can mediate. If you're scared to have a conversation, get a mediator. Yeah. But those conversations, if we had them, I could guarantee that our situation would be very different. Yeah. Very different.
That's so good. I say this almost every episode. I love getting the things that we talk about up here and bringing them down to the ground of how do we actually apply this to our everyday life, because this is unfortunately in every church almost situation, and somebody somewhere dealing with people is going to be hurt by something, whether it's big or small. And so I love this conversation of shedding light to the things that are just happening and saying, hey, it doesn't have to be a taboo. We all grow in bitterness and we all leave the church. It's actually a space that we can invite the Holy Spirit into and process with the people that are hurting us in a healthy environment. And while that may be the most scary thing, I think often what I've seen is that we quote unquote wait for peace to come until we deal with things. Right. And often it's sometimes you just gotta do it afraid, but do it with the Holy Spirit. Absolutely. And that you just gotta buckle up and allow all of the words. I would say make space for yourself to process your emotions prior to having any conversations. Right. And write them all out. Make some highlights, make some bullet points outside of the emotion, and then bring in, hey, I would love to have a calm, collected, not emotionless, but not emotion-filled conversation about some of the things, because we can either do it with all the immediate emotion or never do it at all. And so finding a space to safely and in a healthy way communicate to not break connection where it's not necessary,
right,
but to actually continue to say, hey, God, how can I love these people the way that you love them? And with my leadership wounds and with all of the things, often the Lord was like, do you want to know how I see them? I know that's hard right now for you. And I'm like, no, I don't care. I don't want to know. And then he's like, okay, I'll ask you again tomorrow. And we begin the process, and he's like, hey, I actually see them this way. And it shifted my perspective immediately of getting out of that space of, oh God, I know that they hurt me, and that's a big bummer, but I don't want to see them any different than you see them because of my experience. And if you are struggling to even just like being around someone anymore, but especially for those of you who are still in the midst of the space where your hurt is happening, asking the Lord for their heart for them in the midst of that, it will help immensely, even though it's painful. And so, Amanda, I would love, before we close, you to give us kind of your walk-off statement of if you could leave our listeners with one thing on this topic today, what would that be?
And probably that, yes, the Lord is sovereign. Yes, and He is kind. And yes, He does love us. And when I say us, I mean all of us.
Yeah.
Every single one of us. In what we would label good or bad, beautiful or ugly.
Yeah.
He loves all of us. And in the middle of hurt, in the middle of pain, find out what is actually your responsibility. Find out what it is that with the Holy Spirit you can control. And the rest, let it go.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's so good. One of the some amazing leaders that were in our environment a couple years ago asked the question in a relationship class, what in me is contributing to this issue? And we were all immediately so offended. We were like, what do you mean?
I didn't do anything.
Like, I'm good guy, they're bad guy, this is not real. And they're like, every situation they'd be like, okay, what in me is contributing to this? And so I think that your walk-off is so applicable here. And so, Amanda, thanks so much for being here.
Yeah,
and for sharing your heart and your process and vulnerably your story and inviting us into a space to just connect with the Lord more. It's so valuable. I love it. So, guys, if you liked this episode, let us know in every way that you can. And we would love to be a place to help you navigate hurt and process and things that you may still be going through, or this episode brought some stuff up where you're like, oh, actually, I need some help diving into this in a healthy way. We would love to be the place that helps you do that. You can contact us at tcbethel.com for more information on a Sozo session, counseling, coaching, all of our e-courses, all of our et cetera resources that we have available outside of just this podcast. And we would love to be a place that helps you walk in deeper freedom and breakthrough in the Lord, because really right here, right now, it is time for breakthrough. So, guys, thanks so much for listening. We hope you have a great week, and we'll see you next time.